Hello, my name is Mr.Sviggels, and today we will be going over the many different German small arms of World War II. Now, what you are about to see does not reflect my political beliefs in any way. I do not support the Nazi Party. The uniforms are purely for historical and educational purposes only. Thank you for understanding this, and let's get started with the video. What you just saw me use was the Kar98K, or full name was the Karabiner 98 Cuts. Developed in 1935 when Nazi Germany began to rearm itself against the Versailles Treaty. It used a 7.92 round and it held 5 rounds in the chamber. It was bolt actioned and was used up until the end of the war. It was produced for about 10 years, from 1935 to 1945, used by pretty much every single force in the German forces during World War II. It actually saw service even after World War II ended by other countries that happened to get a hold of it. The Kar98 was a modification of the previous Gewehr 98, originally developed in 1898 by the Mauser company. So the German army thought that a new rifle that would be just like the Gewehr 98 but shorter, but no less effective, and thus the birth of the Kar98K. 14 million of them were produced for the German army in World War II, and many of them are still around today, after 75 years. So, many attempts were made to replace the Kar98, but we will get into that later. What you just saw me use this time was the MP40. The MP40 was a subsequent modification of the earlier MP38. The MP38 was a subsequent modification of the MP34, which was a subsequent modification of the MP28, which was a subsequent remodification of the MP18. The MP18 was Germany's submachine gun in the very late months of World War I. It shot a 9mm bullet, just as this one does. All those submachine guns I just listed, they all shot the 9mm. It wasn't a very big bullet, but I mean, if you got close to you, it really wouldn't matter. It would go through you. The MP40 had a 32 round stick magazine and fired around 400 or 500 rounds per minute, depending on how the spring was. The German army first attempted to remodify their submachine guns for combat use in about 1938 with the introduction of the Machine Pistol 38, or MP38. They liked it, and so they remodified it into the MP40, which the only basic difference were a few things that were creating jamming issues, and the front part, which was like a rail kind of thing that would allow it to hook onto things on a tank, so that like if you were in a tank and it went over a bump, you wouldn't fly around shooting all your friends, which would be a bad thing, so that's why they changed it. MP40, of course, stands for Machine Pistol 1940, which subsequently means it was adopted into the German army in 1940. Now, like the Kar98, the MP40 was used by pretty much every force. Well, many of them at least. Then the thing about the MP40 is, unlike in the movies, not everyone and their mother had an MP40. Mainly squad leaders, the Fallschirmjäger, tank crews, and maybe a few of the infantrymen in the squad. Not many, but a few. So like I said, it was adopted in 1940. prime usage was probably late 40, or because that's when they really started to be hammered out, was in about late 40 and onwards. I mean, probably a few maybe made it to France, but It was used throughout the war, 1940 to 1945, and later on used by many other countries. So that's the MP40, and let's move on to our next weapon.
Here they are! They're here! Give me a grenade!
Of course, with all these great weapons, a soldier would never be caught without his trusty sidearm. Beginning development before World War I, about 1898 or 1888, around that, the Georg Luger began designing a pistol, ironically to give it to the American Army as their sidearm. When it eventually got rejected for the Colt 45, Georg Luger was not satisfied with this and turned to Germany, and they accepted this pistol and put it in use, and its first action was seen in World War I throughout the Western and Eastern fronts by most of the German troops. It fired a 9mm parabellum bullet, which parabellum in German means for war, so 9mm for war, and it held about 8 rounds in its magazine, internal magazine, and it had, every time you shot, this thing on the top go back up and rechamber the new round. It saw widespread use after World War I with police units, and then finally in World War II, where production ceased actually in 1942, but it never really officially left the service. It would eventually be attempted to be replaced by a newer pistol, which we will get into later, but the Luger would have this sense of leadership and ownership. It symbolized the German army and how well they, as their weapons would look good, they would also work good. So the Luger never left action and ceased production in 1942, but it kept being used up until 1945. So that's the Luger, and we're now going to move on to our next weapon. What you just saw me use this time was the Sturmgewehr 44, beginning development in 1942 as the MKB42. It sought field tests in, obviously, 1942. Hitler was advised about this weapon, but he turned it down, insisting that no new rifles needed to be made, and insisted on the production of more submachine guns. Thus it was labeled the MP43 and subsequently the MP44. When Hitler found out about it, he christened it the Sturmgewehr 44 or STG 44, which literally means in German Assault Rifle 44 or Storm Rifle 44. When it was translated in English, it turned into Assault Rifle 44. Thus the term that we use today as assault rifle with M16s, AK-47s. The STG-44 was the precursor to all modern assault rifles, and never would have been approved if it hadn't been for the company saying F you to Adolf Hitler. So let's move on to our next weapon. And our final weapon that we have showcased today is the Walther P38. Its development began, ironically, in 1942, or actually it began in 1938, but saw service throughout 1938, 1939 onwards. When I said 1942, that's what I meant when the Luger production was ceased. The Walther P38 shot the original 9mm round that all the other pistols and submachine guns of the German army did back then. It held 8 rounds in an internal stick magazine, and it fired in a semi-automatic function. Unlike other pistols, you didn't have to cock the slide after you put the magazine in, so this gave you a very large advantage over your enemy. That being said, it did have a very small bullet and a pretty short range, which is why it didn't see so much widespread service, but it did. It was alongside the Luger throughout the war. Now, what you might not know is that although the Walther P38 was very good in service, it never fully replaced the Luger like many people think. The Luger stayed in service throughout the entire war, as did the Walther P38. They fought alongside each other. Pistols were, unlike other countries, not seen as a symbol of rank in the German army, but seen as a practical weapon, such as the occupation forces. If there were like civilians who wanted to help with the occupation, they would give them a pistol and help them fight alongside, or basically stay here and guard the area and don't kill yourself or something. Just defend yourself with this. Or like sergeants and officers like I just portrayed here. They'd give them a pistol since they wouldn't really go into combat, but of course they needed something to defend themselves with. So that's pretty much it for the Walther P38. That's pretty much it actually for all of our weapons. I know we missed a few like the MG42 and 34, but I don't have any of those. So I'll put some links in descriptions if you want any detailed information on that. But until then, I'm Mr. Sviggels, and I'll see you next time.